Neoplatonism as a term is retrofitted to classify a group of philosophers otherwise considered the late Platonists, that is, working within the dominant philosophical paradigm of Platonism during the first few centuries of the Common Era. Yet, like anything else, it did not and necessarily could not have existed as an island. Let's take a look at some of the philosophies and paradigms which cross-pollinated with the Neoplatonists and their respective schools. I'm Ike Baker, and this is Arcanum. Platonic philosophy was at the heart of nearly all major philosophical schools in the Mediterranean region during late antiquity. Plato's cosmogonical, epistemological, and ontological groundwork was the foundation upon which stood the edifices of the various schools of Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, and other forms of Christianity, as well as Stoicism, academic skepticism, Aristotelian philosophy, and there are even Platonic doctrinal and methodological themes within the semi-antagonistic school of Epicureanism. Gnosticism and much of the underlying cosmological and ontological worldview of early Christianities were thoroughly informed by Platonic philosophy, particularly Neoplatonism. For instance, Plotinus's three hypostases would come to be described in Christian terms by early church father and student of Platonism Tertullian as tres personae una substantia, the Holy Trinity of Christianity. Though Plotinus wrote against the Gnostics and Porphyry denounced the early Christian communities, from an examination of the extant texts, we find that they likely had more in common than the Neoplatonists themselves may have realized or had been willing to admit. There were shared models of the universe and the creation of the universe. There were shared ideas about the gods, the transcendent God, the descent of the soul, and its plight in the material world. There were shared ideologies concerning the nature of good and evil. They were essentially working within a shared underlying cosmological worldview in many respects, grappling with the same questions and attempting to resolve these in a proper philosophy and lifestyle. The Egyptian port city of Alexandria was a place where all these various expressions of religious and philosophical ideals met and interacted with one another. We can think of the city itself kind of like a massive university, with the different temples and schools as departments, perhaps, with many of the major schools working on similar bases of cosmology and cosmogony. The soteriological exemplar of the Christ only found its purpose fulfilled in the cosmological model of Plato and Porphyry's causal hierarchies, and an aeonic descent from the pleroma was based on the hypostatic realm beyond causality. The idea of the soul descended into the realm of materiality became the soteriological story of the fallen Sophia, and the malevolent demiurge of Middle Platonism became the antagonist, and an explanation for the harsh realities of the material cosmos, in their acknowledgement of the lack of a more perfect cosmic plan, befitting an omnibenevolent creative deity. All these ingredients essentially set the table for the necessity of the Christ as exemplar of the incarnated divinity, sent to rectify the fallen soul by mapping in symbolic and ritual drama the acts by which alone humankind might be raised away from the wash-dry karmic cycle of the material illusion and reattain their spiritual integrity, a blueprint, perhaps, for spiritual ascension. Hermetism, on the other hand, was more or less unaddressed in formal treatises and doctrines of the Neoplatonists, yet in whatever references we do have concerning it by Neoplatonists, we find there to be a deep respect and an acknowledgement of the Hermetism of late antiquity more as the faithful expression of the religious philosophy of the ancient Egyptian priest class. It is the ancient Greek and Egyptian syncretism, resulting from the Alexandrian conquests of Babylonia and therefore Egypt, from which Hermetic philosophy was produced, Indeed, its patron deity, Thoth Hermes Trismegistus, was an amalgam of both cultures' scribal or messenger deity, the great teacher of the arts and sciences to mankind. Hence were there so many consonances and harmonies existent between Hermetism and Neoplatonism, such as the cosmogonical figure of the Absolute, the One, as well as the microcosm and macrocosm of Plato's Timaeus and the Hermetic axiom, as above, so below. These also combined in the art and science which we quite familiarly here know as alchemy. We find particularly in the works of the 3rd and 4th century Egyptian alchemist Zosimus of Panopolis a great harmonization and syncretism of these ideas and philosophies. We've covered this in greater detail in our episode on the history of alchemy. What is alchemy? Part 1. Neoplatonism, as elaborated by its founding philosopher Plotinus, eschewed the magical in favor of his rational approach leading to divine Theurgia. However, he was Egyptian-born, and we see in much of his philosophy a general friendliness to certain Hermetic ideas. Hermetism was known for a quasi-mystical approach to spiritual matters, being comprised of both theoretical and technical branches. The technical branch, techne, was comprised of astrological treatises, materia medica, and magical rites and rituals. This we now call the practical Hermetica, or the technical Hermetica. However, we do have a story by Porphyry in his Life of Plotinus, that Plotinus did participate in a ritual almost straight out of the Greek magical papyri, which is considered a part of the technical Hermetica, in which an Egyptian priest invites Plotinus to participate in a ritual to discover his daimon. It is revealed to the priest that Plotinus's daimon is in fact a god. This startled a peripheral participant of the rite to such an extent that he strangled both chickens or birds that he was holding during the ritual. Yet, as opposed to Iamblichus's sympathy to the rites of Theurgy, which raised the individual to the divine, Plotinus is known to have said, quote, "I will not go to the gods must come to me," end quote. Iamblichus, however, attempted to bridge Neoplatonic philosophy with what he saw as the practical Egyptian and Chaldean religious rites. His masterwork on the philosophy of Theurgy was a response to what he considered to be a characteristically Greek, overly analytical philosophizing, essentially stunting its own growth by an overdependence upon the intellectual, purely, whereas components of intuition and divine ecstasy, ecstasis meaning standing outside of oneself, were intellectualized to the point of being rendered inaccessible as experiential states of consciousness. It was the religious traditions and rites of the ancients, the Chaldeans, but more especially the Egyptians, to which Iamblichus deferred in On the Mysteries. Iamblichus comments on the knowledge of Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes, the deity who presides over rational discourses, has long and rightly been considered common to all who practice the sacred arts. He who presides over true science concerning gods is one and the same throughout the universe. It is to him that our ancestors dedicated the discoveries of their wisdom, attributing all their own writings to Hermes." End quote. We touched a bit on the Theurgy of Iamblichus in the previous episode in this series, and we'll also cover more of it in a future standalone episode. However, now we turn to one of the most influential and important set of texts to the art of Theurgy, the Chaldean Oracles. The Chaldean Oracles were a collection of philosophical axioms and spiritual treatises which were initially attributed to the Iranian prophet Zoroaster. They now come to us in the form of fragments of commentaries and quotes from Neoplatonic philosophers themselves, rather than in its original format. These documents were in use and studied widely within the philosophical milieu of late Platonism from the 3rd to the 6th centuries CE, and were regarded highly by both Neoplatonists and early Christians alike. The scholar Franz Cumont has termed the Chaldean Oracles the quote-unquote Bible of the Neoplatonists. The true origin and format of the Oracles is more contemporarily hypothesized to be that of a long poem, penned perhaps channeled by a personage known as Julian the Chaldean. However, some scholars regard his son, Julian the Theurgist, as a better fit for authorship. Again, we see here an importation of philosophical thought of Chaldean or Perso-Babylonian origin. As the Hermetic Poimandros was thought to be a summary of ancient Egyptian wisdom, the oracles were thought to contain the wisdom of the ancient Babylonian Magi. The oracles make reference to the hypostatic trinity, which we see in Neoplatonism and Gnosticism. These are conceptualized as the source of all being, which the oracles call Father, the divine intellect, and the soul, as well as the cosmos creating Demiurge, and a feminine counterpart similar to the Gnostic Sophia named Hecate. A primary emphasis is on the fiery or fire-like nature of the divine intellect, or nous, and its various emanative capacities informing the consciousnesses which underlie the order of the material cosmos. These are delineated as a series of generative triads. We'll cover the Chaldean Oracles in detail in later episodes, but for now we can conceive of it as being what, for the time, might have approximated a scientific text describing the creation of the material and supramaterial realms. In all this, glimpses of the nature of the divine creative agencies can be gleaned, and a species of natural hierarchy extending through the causal from the divine realms is delineated by principles such as beauty, which in a philosophical sense corresponds with geometrical and mathematical harmony, ratio, proportion. These texts did advocate a species of spiritual purification, hearkening back to the Platonic narrative of the soul's drinking of the river Lethe, forgetfulness, before incarnating in another life. Quote, "The paternal intellect does not receive the will of the soul unless the latter has emerged from forgetfulness and proffered a word, remembering the pure paternal symbol." End quote. Much of Iamblichian theurgy rested on or harmonized with this idea, a purification assisted by synthemata, which engenders divine mediation and intercession. In taking the Hermetic traditions as well as the Chaldean Oracles of the time into account, we see here a species of spiritual magic, rather than mundane magic, which is taken to be the key to the ascent beyond causal spheres, and which manifested as a necessary outcropping of Neoplatonic spiritual expression, as beyond the causal spheres cannot lie that reason which belongs only to causality. The death of Hypatia of Alexandria, or Hypatia, is a watermark in the history of Neoplatonism, as she was a gifted philosopher who taught in the Alexandrian school. Her father Theon was a mathematician, but her predilection was for philosophy, particularly Neoplatonism. From the writings of Damascius and Socrates Scholasticus, we derive that she was an adept student of philosophy, and was deeply involved in the affairs of the magistrates of the city. It is known that she was advising Orestes, the Roman prefect, during a tense disagreement with Cyril, the Christian patriarch of Alexandria. After rumors had spread of her standing between them and in the way of a potential reconciliation, she was murdered by a mob led by a Christian lector. However, in life, she taught and was well admired by Christians and pagans alike. Her unfortunate and heinous murder in 415 CE did not have to do with her religious status, despite even the earliest rumors, but rather her involvement in the political affairs of the city, which is always a dangerous game, especially for a philosopher. Up until this point, philosophers were kind of seen as unofficially state-protected, VIPs of any localized civilization. So this event definitely signaled a changing of the times, and a new era in the cultures of philosophy and religion. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE, the Middle Ages began. During this time, the transmission of Platonic thought is extremely convoluted, much of it being assimilated within clerical academia, that is, the collective doctorate of the Catholic Church. At this time, the bulk of European educated class were essentially priesthood and or nobility. However, the Platonic Academy survived for a time. Despite it being destroyed by Roman general and all-around bulldozer Lucius Cornelius Sulla in 89 BCE, philosophers continued to teach Platonism. In the 5th century, a revival of the academy occurred in Athens. In 529, Emperor Justinian defunded the Neoplatonic school, while other centers of philosophy did remain open. The last scholarch of the academy was Damascius, and extant writings tell of the last remaining students and instructors seeking refuge under the Sassanid king Khosrau I on the banks of the Tigris River. It is theorized by some that traveling in this direction and receiving a guarantee of personal security eventually, the Neoplatonic school did not altogether dissolve, and that perhaps over the course of a few centuries, the philosophies of Plato and the Platonic successors were transmitted for safekeeping and evolution in the Perso-Arabic world, where it is known to history that they later re-emerged in such instances as the House of Wisdom in ancient Baghdad. A branch of Islamic Neoplatonism would arise from this tradition through the works of academic giants such as Al-Kindi and Avicenna. In the 7th century, Stephanos of Alexandria brought Platonic philosophy to Constantinople, where it remained embedded in the educational systems of the period. Throughout the Middle Ages in Europe, however, the Timaeus remained the sole work of the Platonic corpus which survived for study and instruction. It is during the Renaissance that we find a homecoming, so to speak, of the Platonic and Neoplatonic philosophies in all their glory to Europe, and this by way of the Florentine mercantile and banking oligarchs, the Medici dynasty. During the first half of the 15th century, Patriarch Cosimo de' Medici employed monks as clandestine book hunters in monasteries throughout Europe, in order to retrieve the body of philosophical, spiritual, and magical texts which were lost after the fall of Rome and the rise of clerical authority. Between 1439 and 1445, Cosimo had made the acquaintance of the Platonic philosopher Georgos Gemistos Platon, whose lectures on Platonism and reputation likely spurred to one degree or another the acquisition of the Platonic corpus and definitely influenced Cosimo's desire to found a new Platonic academy. Platon was hailed as the quote-unquote second Plato in his day. In 1459, after retrieving the Platonic corpus, Cosimo asked his young friend and scholar, of whom he had been a guardian and patron for the young man's life, to translate the collected works. Ficino had attended lectures given by Platon and would be inspired by his translation and interpretation of Platonic philosophy toward a new worldview. Ficino went on to translate Plotinus, Porphyry, Iamblichus, and other notable Neoplatonists. Under the auspices of Cosimo, at a small villa in Careggi, a Platonic academy was founded anew, with Ficino as head. It would serve as an informal group of intellectuals, scholars, and artists, exchanging ideas, meeting casually for discussion and contemplation. No formal educational discourse or teaching was consistently given, at least according to historical record. However, it could be said that Cosimo and Ficino had resurrected the spirit of the academy solely by translating them into Latin, the academic lingua franca of their day. With Gemistos Platon's guidance, Ficino attempted to create a synthesis of Platonic philosophy and Christian theology. These efforts were also carried out by Ficino's close friend and fellow Neoplatonist, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, which has recently been termed an attempted quote-unquote Hermetic Reformation. Though rejected by church authorities, the philosophy and its underpinnings in Christian theology found its way into the philosophical and artistic scenes, as well as in fringe clerical intellectual circles. In 1460, just 4 years before Cosimo de' Medici's death, the Corpus Hermeticum was retrieved by another of his book-hunting monks, the translation of which deeply influenced the Neoplatonic current during this time and further instigated the Rinascimento, the Renaissance, the rebirth. Again, we find Platonism, Hermetism or Hermeticism, and Christianity at the fore of intellectual and spiritual exegesis, the result of which was a complete reinvigoration of the arts and sciences, an evolution of these to a new level, a new arc, and a rebirth of Western civilization. A golden age, perhaps a reincarnation even, a fortuitous reunion of these three sister currents under whose triune illumination the marvels of the world of late antiquity were accomplished. In the 16th century, Venetian philosopher, early scientist, and Platonist Franciscus Patricius advanced Platonic philosophy in universities and enlarged the collection of commentaries we now have as the Chaldean Oracles. A group of Platonic philosophers and Christian theologians at England's University of Cambridge came to notoriety in the academic landscape of the 1600s, calling themselves the Cambridge Platonists. They would remark that rather than being the Cambridge Platonists, they were really in spirit, quote, more truly Platonists, after the philosophy of Plotinus. In the 1700s, a brilliant scholar named Thomas Taylor would be the first to translate the complete works of Plato and Aristotle into English, along with works by Plotinus, Iamblichus, Proclus, the Orphic fragments, and nearly countless other works of Platonic, Neoplatonic, and Neo-Pythagorean philosophy. His list of works is truly staggering. He believed the Platonic doctrines to be a true philosophy transmitted through the ages by a quote-unquote golden chain of philosophers. Quote, "We cannot reasonably expect to apprehend the philosophic insights of Plato by a hasty reading or superficial study. Philosophy, from his standpoint, is no bywork, avocation, or incidental pursuit, but is a living reality, permeating and directing the human energies to the extent that its principles are thoroughly grasped and assimilated. It deals solely with the permanent, the essential. One who is intent on acquiring scientifically the principles of divine philosophy must not deceive himself by fancying that he can understand the writings of Plato and his school by barely reading them. To understand them is to see them, and to see them is to come into contact with them. But this is only to be accomplished by long familiarity with and a life conformable to the things themselves. For then, as Plato himself says, a light as from a fire will on a sudden be enkindled in the soul, and will then itself nourish itself." The philosophies of Plato, as elaborated by Plotinus and ritualized by Iamblichus, would creep into the initiatic societies of the next several hundred years. While it may be conjecture or interpolation, one might see such evidence for it in the symbolism of the Master Mason's degree in Blue Lodge Freemasonry, which, according to extant historical evidence, originated in Masonry in the late 1600s or early 1700s. It is, however, explicitly present in the ritual work of the Elu Koans, an evolution thereof toward a quote-unquote Masonic Theurgy in late 1700s France. Theurgy was also written of by Eliphas Levi, and the Neoplatonists, Plotinus and Iamblichus in particular, were the frequent subjects of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky and her teachings within the Theosophical Society. Then we come to England in 1888. To the founding of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. The Outer Order, which is the Golden Dawn proper, is alchemical in nature, whereas the chief goal of the original RR et AC, the Golden Dawn Second or Inner Order, is enacting divine theurgy. We need turn no further than the foundational documents of the organization, which have been well preserved, to find repeated, explicit, and unanimous mention among the chiefs and highest adepts that the primary goal was itself theurgy, in their terms, union with the higher divine genius. Genius being the word Thomas Taylor used as translation for the Greek word daimon. This and other highly useful information to those concerned can be found in a group of texts called the Flying Rolls of the Golden Dawn. A founding member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, William Wynne Westcott, translated and published a version of the Chaldean Oracles. Certain textual quotes from the Chaldean Oracles are found and used in Golden Dawn ritual to this day. An entire curriculum and course of study was created to this end. We see it persist in offshoot orders of the Golden Dawn, as well as in orders which claim no heritage to the Golden Dawn, but rather from that Renaissance circle of Neoplatonists, artists, and philosophers at the Villa Careggi in the Ordo Aurum Solis. Neoplatonic cosmology has been inherited, or at least itself interpenetrated various versions of the system of Hebrew mysticism known as the Kabbalah. We see the hypostatic and generative triads, the emanative cosmogony, the philosophy and ontology of the soul, and its rectification from a world of sense-material illusion, and the downward pull of materiality, and the soul's ascent through the seven spheres of causality, in the schema of the Partsufim, the Hekaloth, and in the model of the Tikkun HaOlam of Lurianic Kabbalah. I encourage you to compare and contrast these systems by watching or rewatching my series on the Kabbalah. Theurgy and Neoplatonism in general have experienced perhaps another renaissance in the modern day, being reinvestigated at a deeper level than perhaps previously accessible to mainstream audiences. Neoplatonic philosophy and its ritual expression of theurgy are balms for the postmodern meaning crisis, and a deep draught of sweet water for those of us who have been caught between scientific dogmatism and religious dogmatism with no discernible alternative available for decades. The work of such authors and scholars as Algisius Divinis, Dr. Gregory Shaw, John Vervaeke, Jana Schultz, Jeffrey Kupperman, P.D. Newman, and others has helped not only to effect a resurgence of serious interest in the philosophies and worldview of Neoplatonism, but has also gone some way in attempting a reconstruction of what ritual theurgy might have looked like, or rather, a reinterpretation, a modern iteration of that purifying, soul-extricating spiritual practice of ascent. Is there a particular Neoplatonic or Theurgic work that you're a fan of? What new resources have you found to be helpful in understanding Platonism, Neoplatonism, and/or Theurgy? Leave your thoughts in the comments section. If you've enjoyed this content, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the Arcanum Patreon. For the cost of a cup of coffee per month, you can help me continue to produce free, rigorously researched, and practiced material like this. Patreon subscribers also have access to bonus content, including episode addendums and my Egypt travel vlog, as well as other goodies. Please continue to watch, like, comment, and share if you're not in the position to contribute financially. There are always plenty of ways to help me keep the Arcanum channel alive and well. Join me again in the next episode, where we'll dive deeper into the history, theory, and practice of this and many other related subjects. Thanks for watching.